Eleanor sat in her modest apartment, her hands resting on a photo album worn soft by years of touch. The cover, once a vibrant green, had faded to a muted olive, its edges frayed like the memories it held. At 80, her fingers trembled slightly as she opened it, revealing black and white photos of a life that felt both distant and achingly close. There she was, a gap-toothed girl of 5, surrounded by her 4 older brothers, Thomas, James, Robert, and William, in the sprawling fields of their Iowa farm. The sun hung low in those pictures, casting golden light over their laughter. Back then, she was Ellie, their little sister, the center of their world. Trust was woven into those moments, as natural as the wind rustling the corn. The farmhouse, a white clapboard structure with a sagging porch, was more than a home. It was the heart of their family, built by their great-grandfather and passed down through generations. Eleanor's earliest memories were tied to its creaking floors and wide windows. She could still smell her mother's bread baking in the kitchen, hear her father's boots on the porch after a day in the fields. Her parents, Clara and Henry, were stoic farmers, their lives shaped by the rhythms of planting and harvest. They raised their 5 children to value hard work, loyalty, and above all, family. "Blood is thicker than water," Clara would say, her voice firm as she stirred soup over the wood stove. Eleanor believed it with every fiber of her being. Her brothers were her heroes, each distinct yet bound by a shared devotion to her. Thomas, the eldest at 10 years her senior, was the leader, serious even as a boy. He'd hoist her onto his shoulders during county fairs, pointing out the prize-winning cattle with a pride that made her feel important. Once, when she was 6 and fell off her bike, scraping her knees raw, Thomas carried her home, his steady voice calming her sobs. "You're tougher than you think, Ellie," he said, bandaging her wounds with care. She believed him, her trust in him as solid as the earth beneath her feet. James, 2 years younger than Thomas, was the dreamer. With his nose always in a book, he'd read to Eleanor under the oak tree behind the barn. His favorites were adventure stories, pirates, explorers, heroes who defied the odds. When she was 8, he wrote her a story about a princess named Ellie who saved a kingdom with her courage. She kept that handwritten tale, its pages yellowed, tucked in her dresser. James's imagination made her feel special, like she could be anything. She trusted his stories, his promises that life held magic. Robert, the 3rd brother, was practical, always tinkering. At 14, he could fix anything: a broken wagon, a jammed tractor, even Eleanor's favorite doll when its arm fell off. He'd tease her mercilessly, calling her Squirt, but his grin softened the jab. One summer, when she was 9, he spent hours teaching her to whittle a stick into a crude whistle. "Patience, Ellie," he'd say, guiding her small hands. His steady presence made her feel safe, like nothing could break if he was there to mend it. William, the youngest brother, was closest to her in age, just 3 years older. Quiet and shy, he preferred the solitude of the farm's creek, where he'd fish for hours. He'd let Eleanor tag along, teaching her to bait a hook and cast a line. "Don't scare the fish," he'd whisper, his voice soft as the water's ripple. Those moments by the creek, with dragonflies buzzing and the sun warm on her back, were a sanctuary. William's silence wasn't cold. It was comforting, a promise that he'd always be there. The farm was their playground, their kingdom. They'd race through the cornfields, play hide-and-seek in the barn, and climb the apple trees until their mother called them in for supper. Even as they grew, the farm tethered them. Holidays brought them back. Thanksgiving with Clara's turkey, Christmas with Henry's off-key carols. Eleanor cherished those gatherings, the table crowded with her brother's laughter, their teasing a familiar melody. She never doubted their bond. Why would she? They were family, unbreakable. But life, like seasons, changed. Thomas left for college, then law school in Chicago, his visits growing rare. James chased his writing dreams to New York, sending letters filled with grand plans, but fewer returns home. Robert settled in Des Moines, working as a mechanic, his hands still calloused, but his temper sharper. William stayed on the farm, taking over after their father's health failed. Eleanor, At 18, married Daniel, a kind man from a nearby town. They settled close to the farm, raising two daughters, Sarah and Claire. Her life was simple, rooted in the land and the family she loved. When Clara and Henry died, Henry from a heart attack at 70, Clara from grief a year later, the siblings gathered at the farmhouse. The air was heavy with loss, but also resolve. They stood in the kitchen, the same one where their mother had preached family unity and vowed to keep the farm. It wasn't just land, it was their history, their parents' legacy. They agreed to share ownership, splitting maintenance costs. Thomas, with his legal mind, drafted the agreement. "We'll keep it in the family," he said, his voice firm. Eleanor nodded, trusting him implicitly. Her contributions were modest. Her pension from years as a school secretary didn't stretch far, but she sent what she could, $200 here, $300 there, for taxes, repairs, whatever William said was needed. She didn't ask for receipts or question the details. Thomas handled the paperwork. William managed the land, and James and Robert pitched in when they could. Eleanor trusted them to keep their promise. They were her brothers, after all. Years passed, and the distance between them grew, not just in miles, but in connection. Thomas's calls became brief, his tone clipped. Busy with the case, he'd say, cutting her off. James's letters stopped, replaced by occasional emails about his latest book deal. Robert snapped when she asked about the farm's upkeep, muttering about nosy sisters. William, still on the land, grew vague when she visited, changing the subject when she mentioned finances. Eleanor brushed it off. They were busy, she told herself. Life was complicated. They'd always come through. But doubts crept in, small at first, like weeds in a garden. The farm's mailbox overflowed with notices. Bills went unpaid. Grass grew wild around the house. Eleanor called Thomas, who promised to look into it. She believed him, clinging to the memory of the brother who'd carried her home. She called William, who mumbled about tough seasons. She trusted his quiet honesty, or what she thought was honesty. She didn't push, didn't want to seem ungrateful. Family was about trust, wasn't it? Then came the letter that changed everything. It arrived on a rainy April morning, its official seal stark against the envelope. The farm was in debt, $50,000 in back taxes, it said. Foreclosure was imminent. Eleanor's heart pounded as she read it, her hands shaking. She called Thomas immediately. "We'll handle it," he said, his voice calm but distant. "We just need some help." She asked what she could do. "Your savings," he said. "It'll cover the taxes, save the farm." Eleanor didn't hesitate. Her retirement fund, $60,000 painstakingly saved, was all she had beyond her pension. But this was the farm, their legacy. She wired the money to Thomas, her fingers trembling as she signed the forms. She trusted him. She trusted all of them. Weeks passed with no updates. She called, left messages, got no replies. Unease grew a knot in her stomach. She drove to the farm one Sunday, needing to see it for herself. The fields were quiet, the house locked, its windows dark. A neighbor, leaning over his fence, mentioned new owners moving in. Eleanor's breath caught. New owners? She laughed it off, a mistake, surely. She called Thomas again, then James, Robert, William. Silence. Days later, another letter arrived, this one from a lawyer. The farm had been sold for $1. $2 million. Her brothers had signed the deal. Her savings were gone, absorbed into the sale with no mention of her. Betrayal hit like a physical blow, sharp and deep. Eleanor sank onto her couch, the photo album falling open in her lap. The faces of her brothers, Thomas's steady gaze, James's crooked smile, Robert's teasing grin, William's quiet eyes, stared back, mocking her. She traced their faces, her fingers lingering on the girl she'd been, the Ellie who believed in them. Her spirit, once as resilient as the oak tree by the barn, felt like brittle glass, cracking under the weight of their deceit. She closed the album, tears streaming down her cheeks. The farm was gone, her savings stolen, her trust shattered. She'd given everything to her brothers, believing in their bond, in their mother's words about blood and water. Now, she was alone, her heart heavy with questions. How had it come to this? Why had they done it? Could she ever feel whole again? Eleanor sat in the dim light of her apartment, the silence deafening, and wondered if her spirit could survive this betrayal. Eleanor's apartment, once a haven of warmth, felt like a tomb. The betrayal by her four brothers, Thomas, James, Robert, and William, had drained the life from her small space. The photo album, once a source of joy, remained closed on the coffee table, its memories too painful to face. At 80, Eleanor had expected her later years to be filled with peace, surrounded by the love of her family. Instead, she was grappling with a wound so deep it seemed to carve out her spirit. The farm, their shared legacy, was gone, sold behind her back. Her savings, her trust, her sense of family, all stolen. The silence from her brothers was the heaviest blow, a void that echoed louder than any argument. Each morning, she woke to the same ache. She'd shuffle to the kitchen, make tea, and sit by the window, staring at the street below. The world moved on. Neighbors walked dogs, children laughed on their way to school. But Eleanor felt stuck, trapped in the moment she learned of the sale. The lawyer's letter, with its cold, legal language, was seared into her mind. The farm sold for $1. $2 million, her $60,000 in savings absorbed into the deal, her name absent from the paperwork. She'd replayed that moment 1,000 times, trying to understand how her brothers could exclude her. Had they planned it? Had they laughed as they signed the papers, knowing she'd given everything to save the land? She tried calling them, her hands trembling as she dialed numbers she'd known by heart since childhood. Thomas's phone went to voicemail, his recorded voice crisp and professional. Leave a message. She did, her voice shaking. Thomas, it's Ellie. Why didn't you tell me about the farm? What happened to my money? No response. She called James, hoping his dreamer's heart might soften. His phone rang endlessly, no voicemail, just silence. Robert's number was disconnected, a fact that stung like a slap. William, the brother she'd been closest to, answered once, his voice low. Ellie, I can't talk now, he said, then hung up. She called again, but he didn't pick up. The silence from all four was a wall, impenetrable and cold. Eleanor's daughters, Sarah and Claire, were her lifeline. Sarah, 52, lived an hour away in Cedar Rapids, a nurse with a no-nonsense streak. Claire, 48, was a teacher in Des Moines, softer but fiercely protective. They'd visit often, their faces etched with worry as they watched their mother fade. Sarah, with her sharp eyes, noticed the unwashed dishes, the wilted plants on Eleanor's balcony. Mom, you can't let this destroy you, she said one evening, sitting across from Eleanor at the kitchen table. Her voice was firm but kind. They betrayed you, but you're still here. You're stronger than this. Eleanor wanted to believe her, but her spirit felt like a cracked vase, barely holding together. I trusted them, she whispered, her voice breaking. They were my brothers. How could they do this? Sarah's jaw tightened, her anger at her uncles palpable. They're cowards, she said. You need to confront them, Mom. Demand answers. Claire, sitting beside her, nodded but added gently, or at least find a way to let it go. This is eating you alive. Confrontation wasn't Eleanor's way. Growing up as the youngest, the only girl, she'd been the peacemaker. When Thomas and Robert fought over chores, she'd mediate, her small voice calming their tempers. When James felt ignored, she'd listen to his stories. When William retreated to his fishing spot, she'd sit quietly beside him. She'd spent her life smoothing edges, keeping the family whole. Now, the idea of facing her brothers, of accusing them, felt like tearing apart the very bond she'd fought to preserve. Yet the silence was worse, a daily reminder of her irrelevance to them. She tried writing letters, a task that felt safer than phone calls. She sat at her dining table, a notepad before her, pen trembling in her hand. To Thomas, she wrote, "You were my protector. I gave you everything to save the farm. Why did you lie?" To James, she poured out her hurt. "Your stories made me believe in magic, but you've left me with nothing." To Robert, she was blunt. "You fixed my toys, but you broke my trust." To William, her words were softer, pleading. "You were my friend by the creek." How could you stay silent? She mailed the letters, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and dread. Maybe they'd explain. Maybe they'd apologize. Maybe they'd make it right. Weeks passed, and no replies came. The mailbox, once a source of birthday cards and holiday notes, was empty of her brother's words. Eleanor checked it daily, her hope fading with each empty slot. The silence grew heavier, settling into her bones. She stopped tending her small balcony garden, the marigolds and petunias wilting under neglect. She stopped knitting, the half-finished blanket for her grandson abandoned in a basket. Her apartment, once filled with the hum of her daily routines, felt hollow, a reflection of the void in her heart. Sarah and Claire grew more insistent. One Saturday, they arrived together, their faces a mix of determination and concern. Sarah paced the small living room, her hands on her hips. "Mom, you need to do something. Sue them. Hire a lawyer, anything. They can't get away with this." Claire sat beside Eleanor, her hand on her mother's arm. "Or talk to someone, Mom. A counselor, a pastor. You're carrying this alone, and it's too much." Eleanor shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't fight them. They're my brothers. Even now, I love them." The admission hurt, a truth she hadn't spoken aloud. She hated what they'd done, but the love she'd carried for them since childhood lingered, a stubborn root she couldn't pull out. Still, her daughter's words planted a seed. She wasn't ready to sue. Legal battles felt like another betrayal, a final severing of family, but she needed answers. She contacted a lawyer, not to fight, but to understand. The lawyer, a young woman named Karen with a calm demeanor, met Eleanor at a coffee shop. Over week tea, Karen reviewed the sale documents Eleanor had received. "It's messy," Karen said, her brow furrowed. "Your brothers sold the farm to a developer. Your savings were likely used to clear debts, but there's no record of it being allocated to you. It could be fraud, but proving it would be tough." Eleanor's stomach churned. Fraud. The word felt foreign, too harsh for her brothers. She asked Karen to dig deeper, not for a lawsuit, but for clarity. While waiting for Karen's findings, Eleanor tried to reclaim her days. She forced herself to water the plants, though her hands felt heavy. She knitted a few rows, the needles clumsy in her fingers. She walked to the corner store, exchanging small talk with the cashier, a young man who always smiled. These acts felt hollow, but they were something, a tether to the world outside her pain. Yet the silence from her brothers lingered, a shadow over every step. One evening, Claire brought over a photo she'd found in her own attic, a picture of the 5 siblings at County Fair, Eleanor clutching a cotton candy bigger than her head, her brothers grinning around her. "Look at you all," Claire said, her voice soft. "You were so close." Eleanor stared at the photo, her throat tight. She was 12 in that picture, her brothers towering over her, their faces alight with pride. "We were," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't know who they are anymore." Claire hugged her, and for a moment, Eleanor let herself cry, the tears hot and endless. The urge to see William, the brother she'd been closest to, grew unbearable. He'd stayed on the farm until the sale, and his silence cut deepest. She found his new address, a small rental an hour away, a detail she'd learned from a neighbor. On impulse, she drove there one gray afternoon, her heart pounding. The house was modest, a far cry from the farmhouse's sprawling warmth. She knocked, her breath shallow. William opened the door, his face older, lined with weariness. "Ellie," he said, his voice barely audible. He didn't invite her in, just stood there, his eyes avoiding hers. "Why?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let them take everything?" William shifted, his hands fidgeting. "It was complicated," he mumbled. "Debts, pressure from Thomas. I didn't have a choice." His words were weak, excuses that crumbled under scrutiny. "You had a choice," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "You could have told me." He looked away, his silence louder than ever. "It's done," he said finally, closing the door. Eleanor drove home, tears blurring the road. The rejection was a fresh wound, but it also clarified something. William, like the others, had chosen himself over her. Her spirit, already fractured, felt like it was crumbling to dust. She sat in her apartment, the photo of the county fair still Anyang shung the table, and wondered if she could ever escape this pain. The silence from her brothers wasn't just absence. It was a verdict, a declaration that she didn't matter. At 80, Eleanor felt smaller than she ever had, her spirit broken under the weight of their betrayal. Eleanor's days had become a blur of gray, each one bleeding into the next. The betrayal by her brothers, Thomas, James, Robert, and William, had left a void in her heart, a wound that pulsed with every quiet moment in her small apartment. At 80, she'd imagined her life would be a tapestry of memories woven with family, love, and the comfort of the Iowa farm that had defined her childhood. Instead, the farm was gone, sold behind her back for $1. $2 million, her $60,000 in savings swallowed into the deal without her consent. The silence from her brothers, their refusal to answer her calls or letters, was a heavier blow than the loss of money or land. It was the loss of trust, of family, that broke her spirit, leaving her feeling like a husk of the woman she'd been. Mornings were the hardest. She'd wake at dawn, the habit of a farmer's daughter, but there was no purpose to pull her from bed. She'd make tea, the kettle's whistle a lonely sound in the quiet apartment. Sitting by the window, she'd watch the world stir. Neighbors heading to work, birds flitting between trees, but she felt detached, as if life was happening to someone else. The photo album, once a daily ritual, stayed closed, its memories too painful. The faces of her brothers, once her protectors, now felt like strangers. Thomas's steady gaze, James's dreamy smile, Robert's teasing grin, William's quiet eyes, they haunted her, reminders of a bond she believed unbreakable. Her daughters, Sarah and Claire, refused to let her sink completely. Sarah, the older, no-nonsense nurse, would call daily, her voice sharp with concern. "Mom, you can't just sit there," she'd say, her words cutting through Eleanor's fog. "You need to get out, do something." Claire, softer but equally persistent, would visit with homemade cookies or a new book, urging her mother to find a spark of joy. "You're still you, Mom," Claire said one afternoon, her hand warm on Eleanor's. "They took the farm, but they can't take who you are." Eleanor wanted to believe them, but her spirit felt like shattered glass, each piece too jagged to fit back together. The apartment, once a place of comfort, mirrored her despair. The balcony garden, where she'd tended marigolds and petunias, was overgrown with weeds, the flowers wilted from neglect. The knitting basket, filled with half-finished blankets for her grandchildren, sat untouched in a corner. Even her favorite armchair, where she'd read or watch the evening news, felt foreign, its cushions no longer comforting. She'd sit there, staring at the wall, replaying the betrayal. How had Thomas, the brother who'd carried her home when she fell, orchestrated the sale? Why had James, the storyteller, stayed silent? How could Robert, who fixed her broken toys, break her trust? And William, her fishing companion by the creek, how could he have shut her out? The questions looped endlessly, with no answers to anchor them. Sarah, ever practical, pushed Eleanor to try new routines. One morning, she arrived unannounced, her nurse's scrubs still on, and dragged Eleanor to a community center a few blocks away. The center was a modest building, its walls lined with flyers for bingo nights and exercise classes. Inside, seniors gathered around card tables, their laughter a stark contrast to Eleanor's silence. Sarah signed her up for a coffee social, ignoring Eleanor's protests. "Just try, Mom," she said, her tone firm but loving. "You need people, even if you don't feel like it." Eleanor sat through the first session, sipping weak coffee, nodding politely as others chatted about grandchildren or the weather. Their voices washed over her, but her mind was elsewhere, on the farm's golden fields, on her brother's betrayal. She left feeling emptier, the chatter a reminder of what she'd lost. Claire took a different approach. She'd noticed Eleanor's withdrawal, the way her mother's eyes dulled when she spoke. "Mom, have you thought about therapy?" she asked one evening, sitting on the couch with a cup of tea. Eleanor frowned, the idea foreign. Therapy was for younger people, for problems she couldn't name. "I'm not crazy," she said, her voice sharp. Claire shook her head, her eyes gentle. "It's not about being crazy. It's about carrying too much. You need to let it out." Eleanor resisted, but Claire's persistence wore her down. She agreed to one session, if only to quiet her daughter's worry. The therapist, Linda, was a woman in her 50s with a calm presence in a small office filled with plants. Eleanor sat stiffly on the couch, her hands folded in her lap, unsure what to say. Linda's questions were gentle, coaxing Eleanor's story from her like thread from a spool. She spoke of the farm, her brothers, the betrayal. The words came slowly at first, then in a rush, her voice breaking as she described the lawyer's letter, the silence that followed. Linda listened, her eyes steady. "You're grieving," she said when Eleanor paused, wiping tears. "Not just the farm, but the family you thought you had. That loss is real." The word grieving struck Eleanor like a bell. She'd lost her parents, her husband Daniel, but this was different. A living loss, a betrayal by those still breathing. Linda suggested writing, not to her brothers, but for herself. "Put the pain on paper," she said. "Give it a place to live outside your heart." Eleanor was skeptical, but she tried. That night, she sat at her dining table, a blank notebook before her. She wrote about the farm, the smell of hay, the creak of the porch swing, the way her mother's voice carried over the fields at dusk. She wrote about her brothers, their laughter, their promises. Then she wrote about the betrayal, her anger spilling onto the page. "You took more than the farm," she wrote, her pen pressing hard. "You took my trust, my history, my spirit." The words didn't erase the pain, but they gave it shape, something she could hold and examine. She wrote every night, the notebook filling with her grief, her memories, her questions. Small rituals began to anchor her. She started walking daily, a slow loop around her neighborhood. The rhythm of her steps, the crunch of leaves underfoot, grounded her. She'd notice small things, a child's bike left on a lawn, a dog chasing its tail, and they'd spark fleeting moments of lightness. She began talking to herself during these walks, sometimes to God, though her faith had long been dormant. "Give me strength," she'd whisper, unsure if anyone was listening. She wasn't sure she believed in answers, but the act of asking felt like a lifeline, a way to keep her spirit from slipping away entirely. At the community center, Eleanor met Ruth, a 78-year-old widow with a sharp wit and warm eyes. Ruth noticed Eleanor's quietness during a card game and slid into the seat beside her. "You look like you're carrying the world," Ruth said, her voice matter of fact. Eleanor hesitated, then shared a piece of her story, the farm, the betrayal, the silence. Ruth listened, her face unflinching but kind. "Family can break you," she said when Eleanor finished. "I lost a son to addiction. It's a different kind of betrayal, but it cuts just as deep. You're still here, though. That's something." Ruth's words, raw and honest, pierced Eleanor's fog. She wasn't alone in her pain. Ruth became a friend, a beacon in Eleanor's darkness. They'd meet for tea at the center, sharing stories of loss and resilience. Ruth spoke of her son, his laughter, his struggles, and how she'd learned to live with the hole he'd left. "You don't heal by forgetting," Ruth said one afternoon, stirring sugar into her tea. "You heal by living, by finding new things to hold on to." Eleanor clung to those words, a flicker of hope in her gray world. Ruth's strength, quiet but unyielding, showed her that survival was possible, even after betrayal. Eleanor began volunteering at the center, teaching a knitting class to younger seniors. The first session was awkward. Her hands shook as she demonstrated stitches, her voice unsteady, but the act of teaching, of passing on something tangible, stirred something in her. The women in the class, with their eager questions and clumsy needles, reminded her of her daughters, her younger self. One woman, a 65-year-old named Marie, thanked Eleanor after a lesson, her eyes bright. "You're good at this," Marie said. The compliment, small as it was, warmed Eleanor, a reminder that she still had something to give. Her faith, long buried under years of routine, began to stir. She joined a church group, not for sermons, but for the quiet moments of prayer. The group met weekly, a mix of older women and a few men, their voices soft as they shared hopes and fears. Eleanor didn't speak of her brothers, but she prayed for peace, for them, for herself. Faith wasn't a cure, but it was a companion, a whisper that she might find meaning again. She'd sit in the pew, her hands clasped, and feel a small spark of her old resilience, the Ellie who'd once believed in unbreakable bonds. One evening, Ruth invited her to a community potluck. Eleanor hesitated, the idea of crowds daunting, but Ruth's insistence won out. The event was loud, filled with laughter and clinking dishes, and Eleanor found herself smiling as Ruth teased her about her overcooked casserole. For the first time in months, she felt a flicker of joy, fragile but real. She wasn't whole, but she was moving, step by step, toward something new. Her spirit, though battered, was stirring, like a seed breaking through hard soil. Eleanor's notebook, now thick with pages of grief and anger, had become her confidant. At 80, she'd filled it with memories of the Iowa farm, her brother's laughter, and the sting of their betrayal. The sale of the family farm for $1. $2 million, her $60,000 in savings absorbed without her consent, and the silence that followed had shattered her spirit. Yet, writing had given her clarity, a map of her pain. She wasn't ready to forgive Thomas, James, Robert, or William, but she needed to face them, not for their sake, but for her own. She needed to speak her truth, to reclaim the voice they'd silenced. Her spirit, though scarred, was stirring, and this was the next step. The idea of confronting her brothers terrified her. As the youngest sibling, the only girl, Eleanor had always been the peacemaker, smoothing over arguments, soothing tempers. To stand before Thomas, the serious eldest, or Robert, with his sharp temper, felt like stepping into a storm. James, the dreamer, might listen, but William's quiet betrayal cut deepest. Yet the silence from all four was a weight she could no longer carry. Her daughters, Sarah and Claire, had urged action, Sarah pushing for a lawsuit, Claire for therapy, but Eleanor didn't want courts or counselors to define her healing. She wanted answers, or at least the chance to be heard. Her lawyer, Karen, had uncovered more details about the sale. The farm had been sold to a developer to clear personal debts. Thomas's struggling law firm, James's gambling losses, Robert's medical bills, and William's mismanagement of farm funds. Eleanor's savings, meant to save the land, had been a convenient fix, absorbed without her knowledge. Karen called it potential fraud, but warned that proving it would be costly and uncertain. Eleanor didn't want a legal battle. It felt like another betrayal, a public dismantling of the family she still, despite everything, loved. But the truth, that her brother's weaknesses, not malice, drove their actions, gave her a strange clarity. They weren't monsters, just flawed men who'd chosen themselves over her. She needed to face them to let go of the pain, to rebuild her spirit. Preparation took weeks. Eleanor's health wasn't what it used to be. Her knees ached, her energy waned, but her resolve grew. She planned her visits carefully, starting with Thomas in Chicago, then James in New York, Robert in Des Moines, and finally William, now in a rental an hour from her apartment. Each trip would be a step toward closure, a chance to speak her truth. She didn't expect apologies or reconciliation. She wanted to stand tall, to say what she'd held back in her letters. Her notebook became her guide, its pages filled with what she'd say, each word a reclamation of her power. Thomas, the eldest Chicago, was a 5-hour drive, a journey Eleanor hadn't made in years. Sarah offered to go with her, but Eleanor insisted on going alone. "This is mine to do," she said, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She packed a small bag, her notebook tucked inside, and drove her old sedan through the flat Midwest, the radio off, her thoughts loud. The city loomed, its skyline a jarring contrast to the open fields of her childhood. Thomas's office was in a sleek downtown building, all glass and steel, a world away from the farmhouse's creaking porch. She parked in a garage, her hands trembling as she locked the car. The elevator to Thomas's floor felt like a cage, her reflection in the mirrored walls showing a woman older than she felt. At 80, her hair was white, her face lined, but her eyes held a fire she hadn't seen in months. The receptionist, a young woman with a polite smile, led her to a waiting area. "Mr. Carter will see you shortly," she said. Eleanor clutched her notebook, rehearsing her words. Thomas appeared, his suit crisp but his face tired, lines deeper than she remembered. At 90, he moved slower, but his presence still carried the authority of the eldest brother. "Ellie," he said, his voice neutral, gesturing to his office. She followed, her heart pounding. The office was sparse, a desk piled with papers, a window overlooking the city. She sat across from him, her notebook unopened in her lap. She didn't need it. The words were carved into her. "You broke my trust," she began, her voice steady. "I gave you my savings to save the farm, and you sold it without telling me. You took everything, my money, my history, my family." Thomas's face tightened, but he didn't interrupt. She spoke of their childhood, his promises to protect her, the vow they'd made to keep the farm. "I deserve better," she said, her voice rising. "Why did you do it?" Thomas leaned back, his fingers steepled. "It was a mess, Ellie," he said, his tone clipped. "The farm was bleeding money. Taxes, debts, it was going under. I did what I had to do to save us all." His words were rehearsed, a lawyer's defense. He spoke of his firm's financial troubles, the pressure to keep it afloat. "Your money helped clear the taxes," he said, but his eyes shifted, avoiding hers. Eleanor knew he was lying, or at least twisting the truth. Karen had confirmed her savings never went to taxes. They'd padded the sales profits. "You could have told me," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have asked me." Thomas sighed, his face softening for a moment, but no apology came. "It's done," he said, echoing William's word from months before. Eleanor stood, her legs shaky, but her resolve firm. "I needed to say this," she said. "Not for you, but for me." She left, the door closing softly behind her. In the elevator, tears came, but so did a lightness. She'd faced Thomas, the brother she'd once idolized, and spoken her truth. Her spirit felt a fraction less broken. James, the dreamer New York, was a bigger leap. Eleanor hadn't flown in years, and the idea of navigating airports alone was daunting. Claire booked her ticket, drove her to the airport, and hugged her tightly at the gate. "You're braver than you know, Mom," Claire said. Eleanor didn't feel brave, but she boarded the plane, her notebook in her carry-on, her heart heavy with anticipation. James lived in Brooklyn, a world of noise and color far from their Iowa roots. She'd called ahead, leaving a voicemail. "I'm coming to talk. Please see me." He'd texted back a time and place, a cafe near his apartment. It was more than she'd gotten from the others. The flight was turbulent, matching her nerves. In New York, she took a cab to the cafe, a small place with mismatched tables and the smell of fresh coffee. James was waiting outside, his hair gray but still unruly, his eyes wary. At 88, he looked thinner, his dreamer's spark dimmed. "Ellie," he said, his voice soft, and hugged her awkwardly. They sat at a corner table, the hum of conversation around them. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened her notebook, though she didn't read from it. She needed to see his eyes, to know if the brother who'd written her stories was still there. "I trusted you," she said, her voice low but firm. "Your stories made me believe in magic, in family. But you let them sell the farm, my savings, without a word. You broke my heart." James flinched, his fingers twisting a napkin. He admitted following Thomas's lead, his gambling debts pushing him to agree. "I was ashamed," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't know how to face you." Then, to her surprise, he added, "I'm sorry, Ellie. I should have fought for you." The apology, the only one she'd hear, caught her off guard. It wasn't enough to erase the pain, but it was a crack in the wall of silence. She told him about the farm's meaning, the memories it held, the betrayal's weight. He listened, his eyes wet, but offered no excuses beyond his shame. When she stood to leave, he hugged her again, longer this time. "I miss you," he whispered. Eleanor nodded, her throat tight, but didn't promise to stay in touch. She left the cafe, the city's noise fading as she felt another piece of her burden lift. James's apology, small as it was, gave her a sliver of hope, not for reconciliation, but for her own healing. Robert. The Fixer Des Moines was closer, a 2-hour drive, but Robert's temper made Eleanor wary. At 86, he was still a mechanic, though semi-retired, living in a small house near his old shop. She called, leaving a voicemail, but got no reply. She drove anyway, her notebook on the passenger seat, her resolve tested by memories of Robert's gruff teasing. He'd fixed her toys, her bike, but his temper had always simmered, ready to flare. She parked outside his house, a tidy bungalow with a cluttered garage. Her knock was answered by Robert, his hands stained with grease, his face set in a scowl. "What do you want, Ellie?" he asked, not inviting her in. She stood on the porch, the wind cold against her face. "I need to talk," she said, her voice steady. "About the farm, my savings, what you did." Robert's eyes narrowed. "We all agreed to sell," he snapped, rewriting history. "You're making a fuss over nothing." Eleanor's anger flared, but she held it in check. She spoke of her trust, her contribution, the betrayal of being excluded. "You fixed things," she said. "But you broke me." Robert's face reddened, his voice rising. "You think you're the only one who lost something? I had bills, medical debts. The farm was a money pit." His words were a wall, deflecting blame. Eleanor didn't argue. She'd come to speak, not fight. "I deserve to know," she said, her voice calm. "You owed me that." She turned to leave, his silence following her. In the car, she cried, not for Robert's anger, but for the brother he'd once been. The confrontation, though painful, freed another piece of her spirit. She'd faced him, and his defensiveness was his burden, not hers. William, the quiet one William, at 83, was the hardest. He'd been her closest brother, her fishing companion by the creek, his quiet presence a comfort. His betrayal, his silence, cut deepest. He'd moved to a rental an hour away after the sale, a fact that stung like rejection. Eleanor drove there on a rainy afternoon, her notebook damp from her grip. The house was small, its yard bare, a stark contrast to the farm's sprawling fields. She knocked, her heart in her throat. William opened the door, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed. "Ellie," he said, his voice breaking. He stepped aside, letting her in. The living room was sparse, a single chair by a window, a life stripped down. She sat, her notebook unopened, and spoke. "You were my friend," she said, tears falling. "You knew about the sale, my money, and said nothing. Why?" William's hands shook as he sat across from her. "I was weak," he said, his voice barely audible. "Thomas pushed, I followed. I failed you." He cried, his shoulders shaking, and Eleanor felt a pang of pity, but no forgiveness came. She spoke of their creek days, the farm's meaning, the trust he'd broken. He listened, his tears falling, but offered no defense beyond his weakness. "I'm sorry," he said, echoing James, but felt hollow, too late. Eleanor stood, her legs steady now. "I needed to say this," she said. "For me." She left, the rain matching her tears, but her heart lighter. William's remorse was his to carry. She'd reclaimed her voice. Eleanor returned home, exhausted but unburdened. Each visit had chipped away at her pain, not because her brothers had redeemed themselves. Only James had apologized, but because she'd spoken her truth. Her spirit, though scarred, felt less broken. She sat in her apartment, the notebook open, and wrote, "I faced them. I'm still here." The words were a declaration, a step toward healing. She wasn't whole, but she was stronger, ready to let go of the weight she'd carried for too long. Eleanor's 81st birthday arrived with a quiet grace, a milestone she hadn't expected to mark with anything but sorrow. The betrayal by her brothers, Thomas, James, Robert, and William, had left her spirit in pieces. The sale of the family farm and the loss of her $60,000 in savings, a wound that had festered for months. Yet, as she stood in her small apartment, The morning light filtering through the curtains, she felt a shift. Her confrontations with her brothers had not brought the apologies or closure she'd once craved, but they had given her something else, her voice. At 80, she'd faced them, spoken her truth, and walked away lighter. Now, at 81, she was ready to rebuild, to find meaning in a life reshaped by loss. Her daughters, Sarah and Claire, insisted on celebrating. They arrived early, their arms full of decorations and food. Sarah, the practical nurse, strung fairy lights across Eleanor's living room, her brisk efficiency softened by a warm smile. Claire, the gentle teacher, baked a chocolate cake, Eleanor's favorite, and set the table with mismatched plates that reminded Eleanor of their old farmhouse dinners. The apartment, once a tomb of silence, buzzed with life as her grandchildren, Sarah's son, Ethan, 16, and Claire's daughters, Lily, 12, and Mia, 9, rushed in, their laughter a melody Eleanor hadn't realized she'd missed. "Happy birthday, Grandma!" they shouted, piling onto her for hugs. For the first time in months, Eleanor's smile felt real, not forced. Ruth, her friend from the community center, arrived with a homemade apple pie, her sharp wit cutting through the chaos. "You're older than me now, Eleanor," she teased, setting the pie on the counter. "Don't think you can boss me around." Eleanor laughed, a sound that surprised her with its lightness. The gathering was small, but it filled the apartment with warmth, a stark contrast to the gray days after the betrayal. As they ate cake and shared stories, Eleanor looked around, her heart swelling. This was her family now, her daughters, her grandchildren, her friend. Her brothers had taken the farm, but they couldn't take this. The party marked a turning point. Eleanor had spent months trapped in the pain of her brother's silence, their refusal to acknowledge the sale or her stolen savings. But confronting them had shifted something inside her. Thomas's cold dismissal, Robert's defensive anger, William's tearful remorse, and even James's small apology had shown her their truth. They were flawed, weak men who'd chosen themselves over her. She didn't need their remorse to move forward. She needed herself, her strength, her spirit, and slowly, she was finding it again. Her days began to take on a new rhythm. She woke early, a habit from her farm days, and made tea, savoring the ritual. She'd sit by the window, watching the neighborhood wake, and feel a quiet gratitude for the simple act of being. Her balcony garden, neglected during her darkest months, became a project. She pulled weeds, planted new marigolds, and tended them daily, her hands steady in the soil. Each bloom was a small victory, a sign that life could grow again, even in hard ground. She talked to the plants sometimes, whispering encouragements, a habit that felt silly but grounding. "Keep growing," she'd say, as much to herself as to the flowers. Her notebook, once a vessel for grief, became a space for hope. She wrote less about the betrayal and more about the present. Ethan's soccer games, Lily's shy smile, Mia's endless questions. She wrote about Ruth's stories, the way her friends' laughter made the community center feel like home. She wrote about the sunsets from her balcony, the way the sky turned pink and gold, a beauty she'd overlooked in her pain. Writing wasn't a cure, but it was a mirror reflecting a woman who was still here, still fighting. Sarah and Claire noticed the change. "You're different, Mom," Sarah said one evening, helping Eleanor clear dishes after dinner. "Not back to normal, but stronger." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. "I'm trying," she said. Claire, sitting nearby, reached for her hand. "You're doing more than trying," she said. "You're living." Their words, simple but sincere, were a balm. Eleanor had always been their rock, the mother who'd weathered their father's death, their own struggles. Now, they were hers, their love a foundation she could build on. The community center became her sanctuary. She'd started volunteering there, teaching knitting to a group of younger seniors. The class had grown from 5 women to a dozen, their chatter filling the small room with life. Eleanor found joy in their progress, the way their clumsy stitches became neat rows. Marie, a 65-year-old widow with a quick laugh, became a regular, her enthusiasm infectious. You make this fun, Eleanor, Marie said one day, holding up a lopsided scarf. I didn't think I could learn something new. Eleanor smiled, her heart warming. Teaching wasn't just about knitting. It was about connection, about giving something of herself and receiving gratitude in return. Ruth was a constant presence, her friendship a steady anchor. They'd meet for tea after knitting class, sharing stories over chipped mugs. Ruth spoke of her son, lost to addiction, her voice steady but raw. You don't get over it, she said one afternoon, stirring sugar into her tea. You learn to carry it differently. Eleanor shared her own story, the betrayal, the confrontations. Ruth listened, her eyes kind but unflinching. You faced them, she said. That's more than most would do. You're stronger than you think. Eleanor wanted to believe her, to see herself as the woman Ruth described, not the broken one she'd felt for so long. Faith, long dormant, began to stir. Eleanor had grown up with her mother's prayers, her father's quiet hymns, but after their deaths, she'd drifted from church. The betrayal had made her question God. How could he let her brothers destroy her trust? But a neighbor, a kind woman named Helen, invited her to a church group, a small gathering of seniors who met for prayer and coffee. Eleanor went, hesitant, expecting sermons that would feel hollow. Instead, she found a circle of people sharing hopes, fears, and quiet faith. They didn't preach, they listened. Eleanor didn't speak of her brothers, but she prayed silently, asking for peace, for strength. I don't know if you're there, she'd whisper, but I need something to hold on to. The prayers, the community, became a companion, a soft light in her darkness. One evening, a letter arrived from James, the only brother who'd apologized. It was short, written in his familiar, looping handwriting. I can't undo what I did, he wrote. I am sorry, Eddie. I enclosed what I could. Tucked inside was a check for $5,000. Not her full savings, but a gesture. Eleanor stared at it, her emotions tangled. Part of her wanted to tear it up, to reject his attempt at amends. But another part, the part that was learning to let go, saw it for what it was, his guilt, his attempt to make things right. She didn't need his money. She needed her spirit. The next day, she donated the check to the community center, earmarking it for art supplies for the children's program. The act felt like a release, a way to turn pain into something good. She wrote back to James, not to forgive, but to acknowledge his effort. I got your letter, she wrote. I don't know if we'll ever be family again, but I'm trying to move forward. I hope you find peace. She mailed it, her hand steady, and felt another weight lift. The letter wasn't about rebuilding their bond. It was about closing a chapter, about choosing herself. Eleanor's days grew fuller. She walked her neighborhood loop, noticing new details, a bluebird's nest, a child's chalk drawing on the sidewalk. She knitted blankets for her grandchildren, each stitch a small act of love. She joined a book club at the center, reading novels Ruth recommended, their discussions sparking laughter and debate. She tended her balcony garden, the marigolds blooming brighter each day. Each act, small as it was a brick in the foundation of her new life. Her brothers remained distant, their silence a choice she could no longer control. Thomas's coldness, Robert's anger, William's remorse, James's partial amends. They were their stories now, not hers. She thought of them less, their faces fading from the forefront of her mind. The farm, once the heart of her identity, was a memory, not her present. Her present was Sarah's proud smile, Claire's gentle hugs, Ethan's shy grin, Lily's drawings, Mia's chatter. It was Ruth's laughter, the knitting class's chatter, the church group's quiet prayers. One evening, Eleanor sat on her balcony, the sunset painting the sky in hues of pink and gold. She held her notebook, now filled with stories of growth, not just pain. She wrote, I'm 81, and I'm enough. They broke my spirit, but I'm rebuilding it piece by piece. The words were a vow, a promise to herself. She closed the notebook, her heart steady, and watched the sky darken. The stars emerged, faint but persistent, like the spark in her soul. She was scarred, but she was whole, a woman who'd faced betrayal and chosen to live.